Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with a question. Not to offend or accuse, but to awaken. What if you're living a lie? Let me ask you something difficult, something uncomfortable, perhaps even offensive to your ego. But it's the kind of question that, if you have the courage to confront it, can radically reorient the trajectory of your life. Are you playing a part? Are you presenting yourself to the world and maybe even to yourself as someone you're not? Because appearances are deceptive. And that's not just a cynical statement, it's a tragic reality. You can spend your entire life building a version of yourself that looks perfectly admirable from the outside, while on the inside, where it matters most, you're hollow, conflicted, fragmented. You can speak the right words, perform the right rituals, conform to the expectations of your community, even adopt the mannerisms of someone who has it all together. But all the while, you might be standing on a foundation that's cracking beneath your feet. Why do we do that? Why do we construct these polished facades? Because it's easy, it's praised, it protects us from scrutiny. We all know how the game works. You smile in public, you keep your opinions in check, you say what people want to hear, you tell yourself that as long as you're keeping up the appearance of success, goodness, even godliness, you're fine. But deep down, you feel the tension, the discomfort that comes from pretending. You feel it when you're alone, when your guard is down. There's a voice inside you that whispers, "This isn't real, you're not being honest." And that's dangerous, not just psychologically, but spiritually. Because there's a point where the lie you're living becomes so familiar, so consistent, that it actually starts to feel like the truth. You start to believe your own performance. You lose track of who you really are. You bury the parts of yourself that are weak, afraid, confused, the parts that actually need attention, healing, and grace. And eventually you become a stranger to yourself. People often think that evil is loud and obvious, that it wears a mask and kicks down the door. But more often it starts with something quieter, subtle compromises, small deceptions, the decision to ignore that inner voice just one more time. And that's what makes the lie so seductive. It doesn't demand that you become a monster overnight. It simply asks that you pretend a little bit longer. And we're good at pretending. We're rewarded for it. Society teaches us how to curate our image. We have filters for our flaws, not just on social media, but in real life. We learn how to hide our anger, our shame, our doubts. We become experts in performance. And then when we start to feel lost or hollow, we distract ourselves with work, with pleasure, with entertainment, with spiritual platitudes. But here's the paradox. The more energy you invest in appearances, the more distant you become from truth. And the more you pursue truth, brutal soul-searching truth, the less energy you have for appearances. Truth demands vulnerability. It demands humility. It demands that you stop pretending, that you look in the mirror and see not the version of yourself you've crafted for others, but the person you actually are. And that confrontation is painful, but it's necessary, because the alternative, living a lie, is far more destructive in the end. It will eat you from the inside out. You'll find yourself surrounded by people who don't really know you, chasing goals you don't really care about, clinging to a faith that isn't deeply rooted. You'll end up alone in a crowd, speaking words that don't move you, praying prayers that don't touch you, clapping along with songs you don't believe. It's a tragedy, but it's a common one, and if you're not careful, it can be yours. So what do you do if you realize that your life, or parts of it, is a performance? You stop. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but quietly, sincerely. You stop running. You sit still long enough to listen. You ask yourself the questions you've been avoiding. What do I actually believe? What do I fear? What am I hiding? And you be honest, ruthlessly honest, with the answers. You don't need to have all the solutions today, but you do need to start telling the truth, first to yourself, then to someone you trust, then to God, not with polished words or rehearsed confessions, but with real, raw honesty, because only the truth can set you free. Only the truth can rebuild your life on a foundation that doesn't crack. And here's the thing, you were never meant to live as a fraud. That's not strength, that's slavery. Real strength is in the man or woman who looks truth in the face and doesn't flinch, who chooses integrity over comfort, who would rather be broken in honesty than whole in deception. Because brokenness can be, but lies have to be torn down before the healing can begin. So I'll ask you once more, not as a condemnation, but as a challenge. What if you're living a lie? One of the most terrifying truths you can confront in life, and I don't say this lightly, is the reality that you can lie to yourself so convincingly, so repeatedly, that eventually, you believe it. That's not just a psychological quirk. That's a deeply spiritual and existential crisis. Because if you can't trust the voice inside your own head, if the person you see in the mirror is participating in your own manipulation, then what exactly is left to anchor you? We often think of deception as something external. We associate it with being misled by someone else, by culture, by leaders, by the media. But those deceptions are obvious compared to the insidious nature of self-deception. That's the one you never see coming. Because you're both the deceiver and you're the one building the prison and the one trapped inside it. And people do this all the time. You tell yourself you're doing okay when you're not. You tell yourself you're spiritually alive when you're actually cold and drift. You say things like, I'm just tired, or it's just a phase, when in fact there's a serious fracture forming inside you, a gap between who you pretend to be and who you really are. And the longer that fracture goes unaddressed, the more dangerous it becomes. You start patching it with superficial solutions, activity, affirmation, routine, but underneath, something is rotting, and eventually that rot will surface through bitterness, through breakdown, through complete collapse. But you don't see it coming because you've trained yourself not to look. You've created a version of yourself that functions just well enough to silence your conscience, and you convince yourself it's real. You can even take that false self and dress it up in religion. That's a particularly cunning version of the lie. You attend the services, you repeat the prayers, you memorize the verses, but it's hollow. The substance, the vitality, the authenticity is missing. But rather than admit that, you bury the suspicion deeper and say, well, at least I'm doing better than most. That's comparison masquerading as righteousness. That's a defense mechanism, not a relationship with the truth. And then when someone challenges you, a friend, a mentor, a teacher, when they say, hey, are you sure you're being honest with yourself? Your first instinct is to recoil, to get defensive. Why? Because that challenge threatens the illusion you've spent so long constructing. It presses into the cracks, and it's far easier to be offended than it is to be exposed. But here's the thing about lies. They can't coexist with truth forever. At some point, the truth asserts itself. It knocks at the door in the form of guilt, or restlessness, or a quiet despair that won't go away no matter how much you try to silence it. That's your soul, the part of you that can't be fooled, begging you to wake up. And make no mistake, waking up is painful. It requires that you admit, first and foremost, that you've been complicit in your own drift. That's not something we like to hear, because it means we're not just victims of circumstance, we're agents of our own downfall. But unless you take responsibility for that, you'll never be free. You'll never break the pattern. You'll just keep spiraling in a cycle of half-truths and shallow reassurance. This is why self-examination is so important, not in a neurotic, obsessive way, but in an honest, deliberate way. You sit down and you say, what am I running from? What have I refused to face? Am I building my life on truth or convenience, on conviction or comfort? And you have to be prepared for uncomfortable answers. You have to stare into the abyss of your own motive. You have to identify the habits, the relationships, the thought patterns that are feeding the lie. And then slowly, courageously, you dismantle them. Not all at once, but piece by piece, one decision at a time, one truth at a time. That's how transformation happens. Now let me say something that's equally important. If you're realizing right now that you've been deceiving yourself, don't despair. That realization, as painful as it is actually a sign of hope. It means your conscience is still alive. It means you haven't lost the ability to hear the truth. And if you follow that voice, if you let it guide you, not just to awareness, but to action, then the very thing that once enslaved you can become the thing that leads you to freedom. But you have to be willing to lay down your pride, your need for control, your desire to appear fine. You have to choose truth over image, repentance over justification, growth over comfort. And that's not a one-time decision. It's a daily discipline. Because the truth, unlike a lie, doesn't serve your ego. It serves your soul. It doesn't make you look good. It makes you whole. And there is no substitute for that. There's no shortcut. no performance, no persona that can match the peace that comes from living in alignment with what is real. So the question remains, have you been lying to yourself? Now, if you're going to live a life rooted in truth, and not just any truth, but the kind that transforms you, that redeems you, then you have to start where all real transformation starts. The inside. Not the visible part that people compliment. Not the curated version of yourself you offer to the world. No, I'm talking about the place where no one sees. The inner world. The inward parts. That's where it begins. And that's where it gets real. There's a verse in the Psalms that's always struck me as both deeply convicting and remarkably hopeful. It says, "You desire truth in the inward parts." Now think about that for a moment. That's not some abstract religious idea. That's a profound psychological and spiritual principle. God, if He is who He says He is, isn't interested in your image. He's not impressed with your performance, your vocabulary, or your ability to play the part. He wants the truth. He wants what's actually going on inside you, not the version you've sanitized, not the narrative you've spun to make yourself feel better, the real thing. And that's both frightening and freeing, because what it means is that you can stop pretending. You can stop manufacturing a false self for the sake of appearance. You can be known fully, entirely, and still be invited into relationship. But it also means you can't hide, not forever, not without consequences. We all have an inner world. It's filled with thoughts we don't speak, desires we don't understand, wounds we've tried to forget. And for many people, that world is full of contradictions. You say you believe in goodness, but you secretly feed bitterness. You say you walk in faith, but you constantly seek control. You declare love with your words, but harbor contempt in your heart. And it's easy to compartmentalize, to keep your public life neat and tidy while your private world is chaotic. But here's the hard truth. What's inside always comes out. Eventually, you see it in small habits at first. Impatience with people, subtle dishonesty, spiritual dullness. Then it escalates. You lose your sense of integrity. You start living in fragments. And the more you lie to yourself about what's happening inside, the more divided you become. Your soul, that deepest part of who you are, starts to split in two. One part plays the game. The other part slowly dies. And that kind of inner disintegration has consequences that go far beyond your personal discomfort. It affects your relationships. It erodes your capacity to love genuinely, to listen, to connect. It isolates you. Because how can anyone truly know you if the real you is buried under layers of defense and illusion? And worst of all, it severs your connection to God, not because He pulls away, but because your pretense builds a wall. God is not looking for sanitized perfection. He's not asking you to have it all together before you come to Him. But He is asking for honesty, not partial honesty, not surface-level confession. Truth in the inward parts. That means dragging your pride into the light. That means exposing your jealousy, your selfishness, your fear, your shame. All of it. It means being courageous enough to say, "Here I am and this is what's real." And if you think that sounds like weakness, let me tell you, there's nothing more powerful than a human being who decides to stop lying, especially to themselves. That kind of honesty shatters chains. It breaks cycles. It invites change. And the reason it's so powerful is because it's aligned with reality. Truth is the only thing strong enough to hold your life together. Everything else, image, success, religious performance, is sand. Now I understand why people resist this kind of It's terrifying to look inward and see what's really there. Because for many of us, the inward parts aren't pretty. They're dark, they're confusing, they're painful, but you have to confront them anyway. You have to go there because that's the ground where healing begins. That's the territory where God meets you. Not the false you, not the filtered you. And that kind of encounter changes everything. It's not comfortable, but comfort isn't the goal, freedom is, and freedom requires truth. So how do you begin? You start by making space for silence. You stop filling every moment with noise, with distraction. You sit with your own thoughts long enough to hear the whisper underneath. And then you speak, not to perform but to confess. You get honest with yourself and with God. Not out of guilt, but out of a desire to be made whole. You say what needs to be said. You admit what needs to be admitted. And you don't rush the process, because this isn't about checking a box. This is about transformation. And transformation doesn't happen at the surface. It happens in the inward part. What would your life look like if you lived that way, completely, unflinchingly honest? If you removed the mask, not just for a moment but for good? If you dared to let truth enter the places you've worked so hard to keep hidden? You would feel exposed, yes, but you would also feel alive. And that's the trade. Exposure for freedom, honesty for healing, truth for wholeness. Because ultimately, God doesn't bless the person you pretend to be. He blesses the one who is brave enough to be real. At some point, after all the masks are off, after you've faced the deception, the self-betrayal, the hidden parts of your soul, there's a question that begins to echo through the silence that follows. What now? What happens when you finally stop pretending? When you finally admit that you're not okay? When the truth, raw and unfiltered, sits there like an exposed nerve in the center of your life? That's where many people get stuck. Because we live in a world that doesn't always know what to do with failure, especially internal failure. We're told to confess our weaknesses in exchange for applause, to be vulnerable so long as it's curated, polished, presented. But real failure, the kind that confronts your deepest moral and spiritual flaws, that's not trending material. That's messy. It's uncomfortable. It drives people into shame. And if you're not careful, it can drive you into despair. But here's what you must understand, and it may be the most important truth you'll ever grasp. There is grace, not cheap grace, not sentimentality, not the kind that pats you on the back and tells you you're fine as you are. No, that kind of grace is useless. It leaves you in the pit. I'm talking about real grace, the kind that looks at you, all of you, the lies, the pride, the addiction, the apathy, the religious hypocrisy, and says, I still want you, I still love you, but I will not leave you like this. You see, grace is not tolerance. It's not indifference. It's not God looking the other way while you destroy yourself. Grace is confrontation with love. It's mercy with teeth. It meets you at your worst and offers you something you could never earn. A way out, a second chance, a path back to wholeness. And here's the incredible part, that grace isn't reserved for the exceptional. It's not limited to the disciplined, the religious, the outwardly moral. It's available to anyone who comes clean, who stops hiding, who says, I can't fix this, I've tried, I've failed, I need help. That posture, that broken, honest, desperate cry, is the very doorway to redemption, because it's the one thing pride will never do. And pride is the enemy of grace. Most people don't receive grace because they never truly ask for it. They ask for relief or comfort or reassurance. But grace, the kind that transforms, doesn't enter where there's no surrender. And surrender is terrifying. It means giving up control. It means admitting your illusions didn't work. It means trusting something, someone, beyond yourself. But that's the paradox. The very thing you fear will break you is what actually begins to heal you. Grace doesn't just patch the surface. It goes into the places where the rot began. It uproots the lies you believed about yourself and about God. It restores your ability to feel, to hope, to love, to believe again. It doesn't make you perfect, but it makes you alive. And that's a miracle in itself. And listen, that grace is not theoretical. It's not just an idea to debate in theological circles or meditate on in isolation. It's a real offer, right now, in this moment, but it has to be received. And that means doing the one thing we often refuse to do. Tell the truth, fully and without excuse. You come with your sin, not your resume. You come with your emptiness, not your performance. You come not as someone who's figured it out, but as someone who's finally realized they haven't. And when you do, when you fall at the feet of grace, not with arrogance, but with a broken spirit, something extraordinary happens. You're not met with condemnation, you're met with mercy. And this is why the entire message of truth matters so much. Because without truth, grace has no place to land. If you won't admit the wound, the medicine will never be applied. If you won't acknowledge the lie, the truth can't set you free. And if you insist on maintaining the image, then grace, the real kind, will feel irrelevant. You'll nod at it, maybe speak of it, but you'll never need it. And the person who doesn't need grace is the person who's already lost. But if you feel the weight of your failure, if your conscience is burning, if you know deep down that the life you've built is a hollow shell, then you are not far from hope. In fact, you're on the threshold, because grace flows downward. It seeks the lowest place, the broken place, the honest place. And when it finds it, it rebuilds everything. That's the power of it. Not that it ignores your past, but that it redeems it. Not that it avoids your pain, but that it transforms it. And not that it demands your perfection, but that it offers forgiveness in place of it. That's not sentimentality. That's not weakness. That's strength, the kind that lays down its rights and picks up your burden. That's what grace does. So the question isn't whether grace exists. It does. The question is whether you'll humble yourself enough to receive, whether you'll stop living in fragments and finally come clean, whether you'll allow the truth not just to expose you, but to redeem you. Because grace doesn't find you once you're fixed. It finds you when you admit you're not. And that moment, that raw, trembling moment of surrender, may very well be the beginning of the life you were always meant to live. So I'll leave you with this. If you're willing to stop running, stop pretending, stop justifying, then grace is not just available, it's already at the door.